if you want to do anything about reviving or reclaiming the Indian knowledge system, you can only reclaim that into a non-nationalist context, which you have to be very clear about. And that cannot be a part of nationalism. And there is a need to reclaim Sanskrit, for example, from the right-wing politics. We ought to do that. The right-wing politics has appropriated everything that we value. So the vocabulary that we use is the vocabulary from socialist point of view. And it cannot be a nationalist vocabulary. It ought not be nationalist vocabulary. We have a good reason not to have a nationalist vocabulary. We have a very important figure who appropriated Indian system, which is Gandhi. He was not a nationalist. He was not particularly happy with the emergence of Indian state. But we should, instead of talking about India, we should talk about South Asia. And which is essential. We talk about appropriating or reclaiming South Asian knowledge systems. Now, any reclaiming of any system which is broken completely, you need to have a proper understanding of the system which has any viability now, that is the European system. So without knowing, without having a thorough grounding in European knowledge systems, for example, politics, for example, philosophy, you cannot do anything with Indian systems. You cannot revive. You have to, somebody who is doing Indian philosophy, I teach Indian philosophy. You cannot teach Indian philosophy without having a very good grounding in European philosophy, particularly the analytic. And I use Heidegger quite a lot to explain Nagarjuna. It makes a lot of sense. I am not comparing them. Run them together. You run these figures together without you don't make comparison. And you use some material. One person who has done very well is the Chilean cognitive scientist, Varela. Varela has appropriated Buddhism, and all his, Varela passed away. Varela passed away a few years ago. Varela was a Chilean. He was working largely in France, and he's a major cognitive scientist and practicing Buddhist. And all his research papers, Varela will have the research vocabulary in the first half of it. Second half, all his work, he connect that with Buddhist meditative practices. And he will have a use of the consciousness. That kind of work you have to do. Not sitting here and generally from reviving Indian thought, from an Indian point of view, you get into, only you get bad name, you will be indulging in right-wing politics. We should be extremely careful about that. There is no revival is possible unless you acknowledge the brokenness of the system. Indian philosophy as a theoretical discipline is broken. And there is nothing called Sankhya philosopher. There is no Sankhya philosopher anywhere around. There may be some Nyayika somewhere in Bengal. And Advaita, yes. But it's a way of life. You have to also acknowledge that philosophy never been a theoretical enterprise in Greek, in China, or in India. It was part of a practice. So when you are reviving, we have to revive that practice. It's already existing in Advaita Mathas. There are many practitioners in India. And the theoretical part, you have to hold it very lightly, theoretical side of it, and you have to emphasize the practice side of it. And also that we are missing in our discourse that very significant ethical side which is not actually taken up, which is distinct from, for example, Christian-oriented ethics, or a secularized version of it. So all these are possible, but the important thing is get rid of, you have to first appropriate it from the right-wing politics. That right-wing politics is the one which is killing everything which you respect. It already killed, no decent person will take up Sanskrit. No intelligent student will learn Sanskrit and use it because his association with the Hindutva. So you have to be very clear about it, what you are going to do. And only then, unless you take a political stand, it's very difficult to work in this area. And you should not talk about India, South Asia.
Myself is Pankaj Mishra, teaching Sanskrit in St. Stephen's College. I'm not going to say anything because I'm confused. I couldn't understand what is the purpose of this workshop, because there are two things coming. One from Santosh Shukla based on syllabus making system, but I'm here only further to develop Indian knowledge system. Yes, I'm quite agree with Professor Shankar that any knowledge system not be based on north or west, east or south, or left or right. Yes, it should be a knowledge system where knowledge should be clearly defined. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had amazingly interesting and diverse views. I'll just reflect on a few of these and then we go on to the next round of discussions. I want to start with a comment on the politics of knowledge. I fully agree that we should keep Hindutva out because it will create problems, and it's also a distortion of what I call Indian knowledge systems. I don't think that Hindutva necessarily, Hindutva is also a container, a set of taxonomy and a set of categories with a political goal. And just like I'm very critical of Western digestion into Western universalism, I think that an attempt to digest the knowledge system into a modern politics is equally problematic. Yeah? So let's just get that out of the way. But by the same token, I don't think that the knowledge system called Indian knowledge system should necessarily be linked with the Indian political entity. So when we say Indic and something else, we're not necessarily referring to a political entity, be it India or South Asia. The Indian knowledge system also exists in Bangkok, and it exists in Thailand, and it exists in Cambodia, and it exists in China, so on. So we're talking about something which is non-political. It's a worldview. When you talk about the Greek worldview, you're not talking about anything to do with Greece. I don't know how many people in Greece really know the Greek thought anymore. So it's a philosophical worldview that anybody can adopt of any language, religion, faith, if they choose to. So if they say, okay, if there's a worldview which says there's karma reincarnation, as an example, anyone can do that. And but it has to be compared and contrasted with a worldview that says the axiom, the foundational axiom is that there was original sin, and that original sin leads to various consequences and various flow of history. Now, we don't have to give these brands, we don't have to label them with any organized system, but they are philosophical alternatives. So that's one point. Now, I'm also familiar with Francisco Varela. In fact, I knew him before he died. We had several meetings, email exchanges. And his mapping of Buddhism into Western categories created a problem. In fact, I convinced him, and he said, I will try to do something about it to reverse it. And my thing to him was, when you have a Heidegger categories, these categories themselves are a limit. These categories become constraints. And you're trying to put something else into these Western categories. Each time you try to do that, you leave something behind, you distort something to make it fit. That's one problem. Second problem is that the traditionalist from Buddhism, which is the source tradition that you are digesting into the Heideggerian tradition, as in this example, the exemplar of Buddhism is an outsider in this discourse, which becomes Heidegger-based discourse. And then there is a room of Heidegger people who will be talking about these ideas, and the guy who's a Buddhist thinker, scholar, yogi, meditator of a very high state says, I'm alien, I don't even know what they're talking about. And when he tries to learn, he will be told that, no, you didn't quite understand this particular nuance of Heidegger, we know it better. So he's second class, he becomes second class citizen in a discourse which is really concerned about his own thought. So my thought, taken over in another framework, gets controlled by people who understand that framework better than I do, and when I'm trying to defend myself or argue against them, I'm at a handicap. So this is what happens when Sanskrit categories, and chapter 5 of this book is on non-translatables. Non-translatables, which means you go to English, study, read, speak all the English you want to, but certain categories you take with you. Certain categories you just take with you, and you don't, like if yoga had been translated as exercise, let's say Max Muir had translated Patanjali Yoga Sutra and called it exercise or gymnastics or prayer, it would really not capture it. So my concern about the view that because the West is strong and therefore controls the discourse, anyone who has anything to say pro-West, for anti-West, for any other point of view, better speak in that framework, means if we accept that, we've already lost the game. It's called someone controls the rules of the game. So if I define a game, and that game is something I'm very used to, and I define who are the referees, I appointed who are the referees qualified to judge, then you can come play all the game you want, but you're not going to beat me. That's really what it is in the area of discourse. So I want to avoid both extremes. I want to avoid the Hindutva, coming at it from the Hindutva, reconceptualizing of the Indian categories, which is a reconceptualizing. And at the same time, I don't want to concede and say the only hope for us is to get digested into Western categories. The whole concept of digestion, which is explained in this book, was introduced precisely to offer resistance against Western universalism. And the idea that we should take, that Varela is doing a good job by getting Buddhism digested into Heidegger, is exactly what I'm resisting against. And I want the challenge for me, how to do that without falling into the right-wing Hindutva trap. So that is the challenge. And maybe we can't do it, but I'm not willing to give up without trying. Yeah, I'm saying I want to resist the two reductionisms, if you will, the two reductionisms that exist, and I want to see if we can bring out the legitimacy of an Indian knowledge system without falling into either of those reductionisms. Now, why do we have to impress people by fitting into the Western taxonomy, which they themselves are having doubts about? I mean, there's a whole post-Heidegger thing. You see, our problem of translating has haunted us, has really cost us a lot. Like Vivekananda made the mistake of taking Akash, I think he called it ether, because it was very fashionable in physics. But then 20 years later, physicists rejected ether. So now where are we? We are obsolete. We have rejected ourselves. Because our tradition is based on a construct called ether, and then the people who propounded it found that it is no good, they rejected it. So where are we? That's the fallacy of constantly mapping ourselves. And you see, the Indians who have offered the service to the West of mapping or translating Indian thought into the West got highly rewarded. I know a lot of these guys. They are rather than calling me, they'll call one of those guys, because they want someone who will explain to them everything in a way that they can digest. Whereas if I explain that, look, you have to work very hard, it's no easy. You have to work very hard, it's not easy, digest it quick and dirty, not easy. You have to work so hard that in the process of working hard, you may get transformed. Yeah, you may get transformed. That takes a lot of sadhana to do that. And that is the kind of guy they don't want. They want the guy, so there's a lot of Western foundations. I am writing a book on Western foundations' role and Western institutions' role, like MindLife Institute, Templeton Foundation. I've got a whole 10 or 20 of them, and I've been tracking them. How they are mechanized, how they are a mechanism for finding the Indian who's very enthusiastic to talk about Indianness, but in a way that is mapping to their way of looking, so they can reward this guy, he keeps applying more and more, and then basically at some point in time the U-turn happens, they've digested what they needed, goodbye to this guy, he's forgotten, the Westerner who's in charge of the digestion becomes the new pioneer, and the story continues. So that is the process I'm actually trying to critique.
If I talk of Hindi language, that why not Hindi should be used in social sciences, it's very possible that they will put me into that category, that Hindi, Hindu, Hindutva. These are the three categories together. So I think this is one of the issues that we have to engage with. In this, I think, on the one hand, even if there are people with Hindutva, and those who are working on this theme, is it possible to think in this way that engage with them politically? But maybe this is a political choice, and let us come out from that and think of what exactly is the contribution that one is making in the knowledge system. We can go along till the time that person doesn't use that knowledge system for propagating a certain kind of politics or doing certain kind of politics. I'm not sure, I'm just putting it forward that we can talk about how do we engage with different kinds of people who are involved in this kind of project. Or should we really keep ourselves away, or should we try to develop a parameter which we can use in evaluating different kinds of people working on this thing. That's one thing that is quite troublesome. Other is the form of knowledge itself. I think Viku Parekh, he thinks that India has a philosophy, but it doesn't have a political theory. And I had a debate with him, and I think that I raised a question to myself: is it that there's a difference in the form, the way we do the knowledge? We document our knowledge. Like for instance, I keep quoting Vidur, who talks about justice when he talks to Dhritarashtra. Is that the form where he tried to put forward the idea of the justice, which is a form of story, a form of narrative or what? So is it that East and West have different kinds of forms of knowledge propagation, knowledge documentation, therefore we are having this kind of problem? And the second thing. And third thing is this, Heidegger and Buddhism, what is that? I'm wondering, I'm trying to explore, and Dr. Shankar will enlighten me more on that. What I'm wondering is, in Germany, we found that there are two streams of thought, and one was extremely impressed by Indian tradition. And Hegel was obviously undermining Indian tradition. But Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Heidegger, this stream was deeply impressed by that. And there are ways of exploring whether they are impressed or not. But generally one can acknowledge that there is a relationship, a deep relationship. But obviously now when we go back to Nietzsche, we don't say that Nietzsche was influenced by Buddhism. Or Heidegger has certain elements from Indian tradition. In fact, when Derrida probably was asked, that are you influenced by Indian tradition? He said, no, I'm not even aware of that. But there are writings now suggesting that Derrida took a lot of things from Indian tradition, and not by Indians, by the Westerners themselves. So it seems that there is a troubled relationship between this and one has to become conscious of this relationship, despite the fact that one would not like to get into the trap that you really mentioned, what I call identity trap. That's not a nationalist question, it's a question of liberation. If West is in crisis, and West is in crisis and finding that they are not able to solve that, and I think I link that with Cartesian dualism and all, they are saying that very openly. Roy Bhaskar says that very openly. Zizek says that very openly. But when it comes to engaging with Indian tradition, even they are in trouble. They are not very easy with that. I know Roy Bhaskar, in fact, had to suffer a lot because he wrote a book which used certain concepts from Indian tradition without translating. And the movement that he raised, called critical realism movement, that movement, I happened to attend that particular conference after the book. And the movement itself almost abandoned him on this ground. There was a big debate there. And I asked Roy Bhaskar, what is the problem? He said, I'm only making one point, that I have written 7 books. If they agree with my 7 books, then 8th book is a logical culmination of the 7 books. So you can't deny this anymore. So is it a problematic relationship that I think one has to be conscious of, and therefore, even if we do agree that probably it's a broken knowledge system, or there's a problem with our knowledge system, and one of the problems that haunts me always is the kind of discrimination that this knowledge system has produced. The humiliation that this knowledge system has produced. How could this knowledge system produce such a big humiliation, such a huge humiliation in society? So that we have to address. We can't ignore that question. And if at all we want to reclaim it, I'm not interested in reclaiming. Why should I be interested in reclaiming the knowledge system? I'm only interested in reclaiming because I think the dominant knowledge system of the West has collapsed completely. And without exploring other knowledge systems of the world, the human beings will not be able to survive. There is a big problem. And one of them would be Indian knowledge system.
Can I make a point?
Now, I don't think the historical analysis and the metaphor of digestion it's problematic. The West's hegemony, Western hegemony, is an aspect of its political power. It is not because West digested something and threw up other things. It's a question of, my own understanding is that till 12th century, there was nothing there. The contemporary West is a new civilization which emerged somewhere around 12th century, what they call the Second Renaissance, which is largely a product of borrowing whole-scale Islamic knowledge systems. Whole-scale. So new civilization emerged. And in 19th century, they rewrote the history when they became powerful enough and invented concepts like, historical concepts like Renaissance and things like that. And they colonized people. Now, if you want to use anything about Indian or Chinese or African knowledge systems, you have to have some other kind of a political exercise. It's only possible within a political context. It is not, the West never digested anything. Some tribes, German tribes, as Hegel himself said, just appropriated. And Islam, whatever reasons, did not use that knowledge after 14th century. One of the greatest historians, or perhaps sociologists, was Khaldun. Now, Islam doesn't talk about Khaldun. And if you read Khaldun, you see that in Khaldun you have the idea of libertarian value and many things. And you know that Khaldun is largely used by the Locke onwards. Now, it is not digestion. Somebody appropriated and nobody questioned that. And when they became economically, politically viable, they claimed that that's their knowledge. Now, unless there is a non-Westerners look at the archives of Western history, then rework on that. That is the political agenda you have to do.
Okay, I think you're right. Okay. First I'll say the European rise by appropriating Islamic thought is what I would call digestion of Islamic thought. I would say digestion not just India. They appropriated pagans and Greeks and here and there they digested and so there's a surviving entity in this encounter between the Europe and the Islam. The European became the surviving entity. It digested what it suited, didn't digest what it didn't suit. The second point I think you made is very, very interesting and very, very true, and that is exactly what I'm working on too. Which you said, what they have to do is to go into the archives of the West and excavate how they've done it to reverse it. Now I'm calling that the U-turn theory. This is my research, is the U-turn research. So my U-turn research is precisely to go into the archives of William James, who's the founder of supposedly Western psychology, to go into the archives of Freud, who's done a lot based on India, in Freud's argument with Jung. They use a lot of Patanjali as a common reference point, and he takes one side, he takes the other side. In Saussure, Ferdinand Saussure's Origin of Structuralism, he does the same thing. If you look at Teilhard de Chardin, his revival, his upgrading of Christian theology, he spent 2 years in India, which they don't talk about, and he wrote a whole lot on the Vedanta system. And he didn't like Shankara's Vedanta, but he liked Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, and he wrote so much about it and mapped it onto Christianity, which I'm bringing out. So I'm going into the archives of these kind of people. There is a movement in the US called accelerated learning. Accelerated learning means you teach your children faster, and they can learn 3 times the speed. So when I started understanding, because my kids grew up there, I wanted to understand how they are teaching. They have ideas which are very Indian ideas, storytelling and use left, right brain together, this and that. One of the things they said is you should sing the mathematics table. Now when I was a kid, I remember in the village they used to sing the table. 2 times 2 is 4, like that. It was called classification, they're singing. So they have done this analysis that you exercise the left and right brain, and they're correlated, the holographic, all the modern terminology. So I was very fascinated to understand. And I went and found out where did this come from, and they gave me names of some Americans who started this. So then I started looking at their history. They got it from some Europeans. And then ultimately landed to a guy called Lozanov, who's in his 90s. He lives in Austria. I'm writing a whole book on Lozanov. Then I went to the Lozanov archive, and I found that he spent in the 1950s, he went to India. And the reason he went to India during the Cold War is that the Soviets thought that yogis could have siddhis. They could have some higher powers which may have military consequences, military value. So Lozanov was sent to study yogis and their powers. So he came back and his report was that I didn't find any siddhis of military consequence, but I found that they have extraordinary memory. They can remember tens of thousands of verses flawlessly, and he was a neuroscientist. So he said, according to neuroscience, it is impossible to have so much memory. So I want to go back and understand that. So he was funded to do that. Then he defected, and UNESCO funded him to go and study, yogic learning, how they learn. So he came back and he wrote the first book on this thing, and he taught some people. He conducted workshops. He became a very big shot because he could teach people how to learn another language. He could teach people how to learn a language faster than the methods were available in Europe in the 60s and 70s. And then his students started what is called accelerated learning. So the purpose of the U-turn theory is to go and excavate this, not for nostalgia, not for heroism, not for some chauvinism, but so we can understand what is the modern application of what we left behind. So to revive our own selfhood, which is what you said, to revive our own selfhood, we excavate in the West to see what they got, where they got it from, so we can actually revive and upgrade our own knowledge system. And maybe some aspects of this old Pathshala system need to be revived, because that is the basis of accelerated learning today. So in University of Massachusetts, where I serve on the governing board, there is a project called Super Accelerated Learning Technology, SALT. We got $1 million grant by an anonymous donor who heard these talks and said, I'll give you money to improve it. And the university, which is a government, they gave a matching $1 million grant. So there's a $2 million fund. And Super Accelerated Learning is being taught in a prototype school in Massachusetts to see whether it can produce results. And they found that in 7 years, they can take average students, including some dropouts. In 7 years, they can make them pass the 12th grade exam and do very well using this methodology. So the prototype is working. So this is what we have to do. We have to see where the West has gotten its knowledge from, go back to that source. Maybe there is more than they left behind. The idea is not to just say that you didn't invent it, we invented it for nostalgia. But the idea is that you took a subset and there is more you left behind. And we want to understand where you got it from, so we can give you the benefit of the rest of it also. So in that sense, we are in agreement.
Why do we present ourselves in such a feeble way, identifying ourselves with the DNA? After all, lion is our symbol. So why not identify ourselves with that symbol?
Yes.
Deer is beautiful, but in Buddhism, both the symbols are used. Lion as well as deer.
No, but we are beyond symbols. We into the actual physiology and metaphysics of what's happened. I mean, I could use a physics.
So, lion doesn't mean necessarily cruel. First thing is that, and the thing, and I agree with you, that they take from the sources and they don't have knowledge. You just rightly refer to Ferdinand Saussure, how many people know about him that he was a professor of Sanskrit?
Yes.
You know, he used to teach in the city of Geneva. He taught Sanskrit.
His PhD was in Pandini.
Yes, definitely, and such a difficult thesis. He worked on the use of genitive case in Sanskrit. This was the title of his thesis, and it was so difficult. Still, it is difficult. I know Professor Prem Singh. Passed away recently. He was trying to translate his thesis into English for 15-20 years, and finally he couldn't do that because he quotes from lots of grammatical texts and other sources which we are not familiar with. The people of Sanskrit, in fact, they are not the part of the mainstream Sanskrit education. So that's the difficulty. So in one way we have to praise them also for their effort, such kind of effort they did. And we should not blame Sasir particularly because he didn't publish his work. He published only a few papers. The work which is known to us, course in general linguistics.
Yes.
That's a
Students.
Yeah.
No, I understand. I think it's important we don't blame the tiger for being a tiger. The tiger's physiology, the way nature made it, it can't eat grass. The tiger cannot eat grass. He has to eat a deer. So it is not the fault of the tiger that he has to do this because that is his DNA. So civilizations have a certain tendency, certain nature in them, and we just have to analyze it clinically. When you analyze the way a particular bacteria works in the body, it is not hatred for the bacteria. Your job is to just analyze with dispassion and in a very objective way that this is the behavior, the chemical reaction that's going on, and this is the effect it will produce. It's not anyone's fault. So similarly, the type of work I'm doing is not to blame the West at all. I think something is going on. Yeah.
Can I make one point? In this Saussure and Derrida, Saussure and Bhattacharya and see now, it is possible to see Saussure as the last great grammarian. Saussure is not just borrowed. But if you read Saussure, you see that two theories is synthesized. One is apoha, which comes from Buddhism, and other is the lang and parole, which comes from Bhattacharya. That synthesis is a truly original synthesis, and the whole thing comes from that synthesis. So it is possible to see him, read him, as a culmination of the grammarian tradition.
Yes.
And he was the last great grammarian, if you want to call him that. He belongs to the Sanskrit philosophical tradition.
Yes.
You don't have to see him, a Westerner, someone digested.
Yes.
It is simply is that it's a great original contributor.
No, this is a very important point. In fact, Jung would be the same way. I would say that sometimes the U-turn is not by the first Westerner who does it. He just appropriates and he produces something original. He's gone. His students who continue the legacy, students and grand students and all that, who continue the legacy, they have an ego thing of who they are in terms of civilizations. If you look at Jung, it's the same way. Jung is full of Patanjali, references to Kundalini, references to Shakti. He taught in 1933, he taught summer institutes on Yoga Sutra and all that stuff. He did. And he was not trying to claim that I'm teaching you something on my own. He's saying that this is Eastern stuff, I've learned it, and it's not very safe for everybody to learn it. I've learned it, I'll teach you what I know. He's very respectful. But after Jung is gone, the people who write his biography, who write Jungian thought, they are the ones who reduce it to footnotes. And then every generation of writers reduce it further until it disappears. So today when I go to a society of Jungian thought and want to present a paper on which is very our yoga philosophy and yoga psychology, they will say, well, what does this have to do with Jungian? We are here to talk about Jungian thought and your paper doesn't fit. And I have to argue with them that it does fit because this is where Jung got it from. So the loss of memory, of the origin of ideas is not necessarily with Saussure or Jung himself. It is subsequent.
So it's a digestion by the system rather than...
Yes, the digestive tract is multi-generational. Even people, Americans who were very close to Native Americans, there were Americans who went and they would get married to a Native American girl, they would go and live with their thing, and they would join them. They would adopt their Native American name and dress and live like them. There were a lot of that. A lot of British here were like that. They were Indian, they would marry an Indian girl, put on Indian clothes and do all that. So you have a very complex multi-generational effect. The idea of romance of India in the late 1700s and early 1800s was also sort of like that, where a lot of people really wanted to love the Indian civilization and join it and so on. But somehow in all these experiments that have happened in history, that was unsustainable. For some reason, after a generation or two, people would come and capture it and appropriate it and use it and discard the origin of that thought process. So the romanticists didn't U-turn, but their followers did. And the people who got married and lived in the Native American tribes, some of them were very loyal. But other, white settlers later on would come, take what they had learned, take all the knowledge they had learned, even use it as tricks against the Native Americans, and distance themselves, and so on. So this U-turn is a multi-generational digestive tract.
It's a very interesting debate which has come up. I'll just take up the issue which Rajiv, in fact, floated it here. That is the methodological aspect. Rajdeep. So the methodological issue is very, in fact, it is a crux. Because it depends on the procedure you have adopted, the method that you adopt to vindicate a particular position. Now here, instead of going to digestive or appropriated, aspects of it, let us go to the basic psychology, basic rationality, basic cosmology, basic biology, basic neurology. You will find that will be a meeting ground. Because the basic rationality of humanity as such is perhaps somewhere it is the same. The same is the case with the basic psychology about it. And there you will find that this digestive aspect or the appropriating aspects, you don't need those categories anymore if you are beginning from that methodologically. So let us go to the basic aspect of it, and there we find that there is some kind of sharing, even if it is not any kind of dominance or things like that. It could be a sharing.
I agree with you that deep down, we're all humans, so deep down at some level of advancement there is commonality, that is true. But since we're not there yet, since we're not at that common set of categories yet, we as human beings have evolved to a point separately from different parts of the world that, with all the good intentions, a person from a certain civilization has a certain thinking, a certain pattern, he has a certain language. So if you standardize one particular civilization's way of thinking and its categories and its methodologies, and that is what I call Western universalism, you kind of handicap the others. Because in a discourse, the Pandit will not be able to talk. I heard that this World Sanskrit Congress, there were so many of the traditional Sanskrits very happy that this project is starting, they want to join it. And they said, one of our problems, I said, why haven't you done Purva Paksh of the West? Why haven't you gone and argued back and given your views? Why haven't you studied, why is it that you're not studying Hegel? And why aren't you studying all these guys in Sanskrit? Like you study the Buddhists, why don't you do that? And they came back and said that, it has not been translated into Sanskrit for us to study in our own idiom. If we were to go back and study it in their idiom, we look like fools, we look like outsiders, they treat us like we don't know. And so, I think there is a disempowerment, a kind of a disadvantage you face when you go to a forum where you are a foreigner because of or an alien, outsider, because of the way the discourse. So while I agree with the gentleman that, the West has done great things and we can adopt some of those, the point is that we also have very learned people who will feel like outsiders. So we have a certain period during which we have to run these systems in parallel. And there is nothing wrong in diversity, an apple is not an orange, and an orange is not something else, and there is not that one of them is wrong. Difference does not mean superiority. This is very important. This will also solve the problem of preventing the right wings to take over. Difference can also mean that we are wrong in some ways. We have because we are different from them, it doesn't mean that we are better than them. In some ways, they may be better than us. And in some ways, it's not either or. It's like in music and dance and cuisine. They are both valid systems, but they are different.
But I'd simply want to point out that I think we're talking about two parallel projects, just to get back, to the earth, as it were. Because the U-turn project, the reversing of the gaze, and the looking for the original Indian, Asian, whatever framework in Western theories and even in the entire tradition is a legitimate project. But I think that we are playing again into those very hands because we're wanting to show, see, you got it from us. So whereas it is a legitimate project in itself, and I think very, very interesting. I'm reminded of a book which many of you would also know, and that is Black Athena. Bernard's book, which he has shown how the so-called Greek civilization really owes itself, owes so much to the Egyptian. And we all know about Alexandria and the library and so on. So, we all have this vaguely at the back of our minds, but people have done concrete work. And I say it's legitimate, it's very, very interesting. But you have to decide, this group has to decide whether that is going to be the major focus, or whether it is acquainting not only ourselves, because we have been talking about our own ignorance, we have been talking about, we know them better than we know ourselves, and how also to pass this along, because of course that may be a third project or a sub-project, that is what is to be done with the university curriculum. I think one really can't look into that at any depth immediately. So I feel that there should be now clarity, because we're all now so full of everything that we want to say, that these are two somewhat independent projects, because each one is going to take a tremendous amount of effort, a tremendous amount. And the other thing I want to say is that there's more than one person who has talked about, let's run them together, or they have been run together. I go to the Heidegger and Buddhism, or Professor Singh has been talking about. Basically, there's a common rationality. I really beg to differ. I think one cannot have this kind of talk without falling into deep contradictions. You can say that deep down, I think Mr. Malhotra actually answered this question, that maybe at some very, very deep level, yes, we're all humans, and so on. But that's not the level at which we are exploring the problems. We're exploring the problem of what's happening to thinking in India today. And we cannot say that you see, measurement is common, but we are measuring it in a different way, and they are measuring it in a different way. I think it is, for the moment, it is the difference that has got to be highlighted. It has got to be brought out, because it's only when the picture is clear, when the image of what it was, or whatever, and all this talk about it's broken and Sanskrit is dead and so on, whatever it was, there are texts. And there are texts, those texts are also not original texts, they are not pure texts. But there is a certain amount, a large amount of material in Sanskrit, in Persian, in Tamil. You can talk about, you can go very far back into the Dravidian civilization for that matter. They still are with us in some way. And in fact, we're very fast losing them physically. The libraries, they're all crumbling.
The Black Athena project is different than this U-turn in the sense. Black Athena was just to set history right for its own sake.
Yes, but this is also setting history right.
No, let me complete. Why I'm saying it is not setting history right. My U-turn project, maybe somebody else is different, but my U-turn project is not setting history right. It is to continue that which we were not allowed to continue. It is to rediscover that what Sasur did is combine and integrate two Indian systems and come up with something very wonderful, so that if I can teach this to our pundits today, our grammarians today, maybe they can come up with a third one, maybe they can come up with a fourth system, maybe they can take, rather than, you see, if we were to assimilate and digest Sasur, rather than them digesting us through Sasur. If we were to digest Sasur as one of our grammarians and not think of us as a political entity called India, but as a thought system. And in our thought system, here comes a genius who happens to be somewhere else, and we assimilate him and include him as part of our thought system. That is a project which is very different from the Black Athena project.
Not professionally involved in issues of philosophy. I've been an observer for quite a long time, and having living some of these things and reading about them. I find this very interesting that you're doing this project, go into sources in the West to excavate the connections that were made in Sudan education. But I think there is a very dire need to do a similar exercise within ourselves in India. This whole question of collapse of identity of Sanskrit as India and India as Hindutva, this whole collapse has taken place because we have isolated Sanskrit and glorified it. Because of the conjunction that Sanskrit scholars enjoyed with the British. When the British commissioned a man called Halhed to write the original Hindu law, what he did was to take a translation, Darashiko's translation of Vedas and Manusmriti, and turn that into an English text and say that this can become the basis of Hindu. So it was the original contact of Sanskrit with hegemonic colonial system, which actually led to the location of Sanskrit as the main source of discourse, main tool of discourse about India. And I think we have ignored the Sramanic languages which have died, Pali and Prakrit, and just to talk about written language. But there are hundreds of other languages through great reservoirs of knowledge systems. When you said, for instance, singing as a method of enhancing memory, a lot of the oral traditions were actually located in that mode. And they are perhaps the original sources from where the written language and the classical languages have evolved. And we are now collapsing all that into Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is India, and India versus so-and-so West. So I think there is quite a bit of U-turn that we need to do within ourselves, and also look at how Sanskrit as a language is being used as a tool, a hegemonic tool, and how millions of Indians and their thought processes have been kept out of the main discourse, and how the sole repository of knowledge was vested in the Brahmanic tradition. And therefore the Brahmins continue to do all the Sanskrit studies. And they control that information, and they therefore also establish their own hegemony. And their collaboration with the colonial apparatus led to repositioning it globally. So there is a whole structure of development of our own languages, which have been also the bane and the boon of the way the idea of India is developed.
Issues which have emerged out of our discussion last 1 hour. One is the identity trap and the category trap. And I think that, more or less all of us agree here that we are not going to fall in that identity. The problem is of category trap. Suppose if you really want to excavate something from your own tradition and try to come up with some alternative to that so-called universality. Manindra Thakur negotiated democratic negotiation. The question arises that on what terms? And that is it. And I think that Rajiv also mentioned that the terms are normally set in advance. So you basically have to negotiate with the disadvantages location. So the question is that, number one, how to do it. I mean, there are people from different branches of social sciences and humanity, and all of us are trying to do it in our own way. But basically, the problem ultimately all of us face is in terms of the categories. Willy-nilly we have to fall on those categories which we really want to share from our discourse. I think the subalterns met with the same fate, The post-colonial theories are basically doing the same thing. And some of us who are trying to do it in a different way ultimately do identity politics. I mean, this neo-orientalists. So this is the main thing, that in terms of category, if we try to do some work, one is this U-turn thing, if we try to, reclaim something from there, fine. But the other thing, that some of our own categories which are rooted neither in those palm leaves archives or in the libraries, but in practices. How to reach out to those areas, and how? What method? I think if we start thinking along this line, I think perhaps we can make some headway. Second thing, I think that this identity and category trap, one person who negotiated this problem with a lot of deftness was Gandhi in his Hind Swaraj. On the one hand, he was taking on the Hindutva, Savarkar's brand of Hindutva. On the other hand, he was also taking on the Western modernist discourse. Simultaneously, he was engaging with the two in that text, Hindu Swaraj. That, his two cassettes are played simultaneously, the old Hindu Swaraj. Now the question is, and therefore, I think Gandhi sometimes becomes very helpful. A lot of people were trying to prove that India has always been a nation, and we are older nation than European nations, etc. And he decided to throw this category of nation through the window, and he substituted it with another term, civilization. He perhaps thought that if we use the term civilization instead of nation, I think perhaps we will be in a better position to retrieve our own resources. So you have the civilization replacing nation in the Hindu Swaraj. Whereas you find Nehru in Discovery trying to prove that India is a very syncretic nation, it's an old story. Other nationalists also indulge in the same exercise. So I think such trap of category is very important. So if we have some similar lens to look at our own practices, our own experiences, I think perhaps in social science, more meaningful engagement can take place.
But this is a very important point. In fact, I have not discussed a single point in this book so far. But in this book, the goal is exactly that, to discuss categories, like the category of history and itihas, the category of shruti and smriti, the category of adhyatma vidya as the search for truth, as the quest for higher learning, versus historical revelation.